Hey, twos or threes. We're back with part 2 of crazy conspiracy theories about Jesus. Let's get started with that intro, Jared.
2 or 3 Guild is a series of conversations with Christian brothers and sisters, considering their efforts and contributions to the kingdom vocationally, their stories and testimony of God's sovereignty and grace, and an opportunity to tackle the relevant issues the church faces in the 21st century.
In this, we seek to equip the saints by networking within the body, starting the conversation around often taboo subjects and seeking to develop unity across Christian denominations and traditions by opening up discussion on worthy and necessary topics.
We want to help educate the wider body of Christ by asking experts and people of wisdom across multiple fields the hot button questions and sophisticated questions that we believe there are answers for in Christ's church, but that there is not necessarily always access to.
We want to further the growth of knowledge and wisdom in ourselves, to worship God with our minds and fellowship with all of you, as we collectively seek to discern what God-glorifying discipleship looks like for us in our respective vocations and in our spheres of influence.
It is our heart and hope that Christ himself would be in our midst as we converse about things we believe he himself is very interested in.
Welcome, twos or threes. Thank you for gathering with us.
What's your latest, bro? You are loving your job right now, not so much loving your job. How's Joanna and Lottie?
Oh.
That's a neutral subject.
Joanna and Lottie are lovely.
Get some news. Show the test.
Before we started the for those of you on video, you'll see, but before we started the cast, I said to Jared, "Oh, we have some news," and I held up a rapid antigen COVID test. Because in my job, we take these twice weekly, because we are constantly going into the office. Our operation is a 24/7 operation in our team. But anyway,
which, to clarify,
yeah,
is a COVID test. It's not an indication of Caleb and Joanna's love life.
Yeah. So the joke was,
twice a week.
It looked like a. It looked like a pregnancy test, and Jared really got excited and then was quite miffed with me when he found out that it was a rat test, and he was probably then quite upset that I didn't have COVID. Yeah.
I just want an excuse to treat you like a leper, basically, modern 21st century version of this.
Well, I'm vaccinated, so unfortunately you can't treat me as a lower class.
Well, you're vaccinated, so unfortunately you can still catch it. In fact, you're probably more susceptible to it than not.
Yeah, and vaccinated make up over 80% of Northland and Auckland hospital COVID patients. Get your booster, guys. It's the best way to fight Omicron.
Sorry, I'm ruining your deadpan take right now. Listen, we should promise right now to not talk about COVID. We've already recorded the COVID cast. We've talked about COVID. Or, we could end up having a whole conversation around that for the next hour.
Conspiracy theories about COVID cast?
Oh, why not?
Well, I mean, a lot of what I think are conspiracy theories or labeled as conspiracy. So,
bro, you gave such a heartfelt response on the conspiracy theories cast. 7 and 8 for those who are interested. Just plug in that for a second. About how no, that was during a dark phase of my life. I'm not going back down that road.
No, I still hold to some. And hey, maybe this is another dark phase, which is why I'm getting more into them again. I don't know. Maybe I.
Why are we laughing? Why are we laughing?
Maybe I need to go back on fluoxetine. I don't know.
We are obviously wanting to close off out on a part 2, talking about theories, crazy theories regarding Jesus. And so last time we obviously talked about Jesus as ancient gods and how people have tried to kind of conflate the similarities between, say, Mithra and Dionysus and Horus, to mention some, with the Jesus narrative. We talked about as Jesus revealed in modern day cult leaders, Jesus as spiritual leaders throughout the ages, kind of a similar idea there, as well as Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and kind of like how the Da Vinci Code has more recently popularized that, or the Gnostic Gospels. First theory we're going to talk about today was an idea that actually the church has dismissed Jesus's theories on reincarnation as it doesn't align with their beliefs. Are you familiar with this one, my bro?
Yes. Now there is a Presbyterian man who in the 70s or 80s became very popular with this idea, and was considered by most to be, and most Presbyterians, of course, to be quite off kilter and just not even Christian, because he was, he believed in Jesus, but that it wasn't quite reincarnation, but it was just more that it was a spiritual kind of resurrection that more resembled reincarnation. But I can't remember the name of the guy. So, but yeah.
Do you feel like this comes from what's the name? Like kind of just plugging in for a second, sorry. Kind of a desire to syncretize and kind of water down and dilute the differences between different faiths again?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's definitely been a push even before this guy that I'm thinking of. But I think there's been a push from a lot of people within and out of the Christian movement to force that pluralism and syncretism into many aspects of life. And it's the whole intolerant tolerance, trying to make, other people believe that, everything works together. It's the kind of Hare Krishna approach, where any Christian who's spoken to a Hare Krishna on the street who's, proselytizing, that they'll often say, no, I believe in Jesus too. I believe in Jesus, and I love Jesus. And I often say what I do try to, it's maybe not the most grace-filled approach, but I try to be as graceful as possible. But, I point out, look, Jesus said, I am the one way, I am the only, the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. And I point to several verses of the Bible that are quite exclusive truth claims, and then point out that while their belief system says that others are compatible, mine does not. And I have noticed that does tend to spark a little bit of frustration with Hare Krishnas, and that may be due to a variety of things, but then they become more angry because they're not supposed to get angry and frustrated as part of their approach to life in general. They're supposed to be very chilled out, very, centered and balanced. And I think, honestly, there will be some psychological reasons to that. There will be some social things in terms of them thinking I'm intolerant and I'm stubborn, and could be some of that. But ultimately, I do think there is a spiritual side of that
I was going to say, they're not wrong, but and I totally deflated your excellent point. Yeah, there's a spiritual,
I do believe there is a spiritual side of that is, within them, that gets angry at the fact that something is pointing out that Jesus is the way. And I believe that more than most other religions who tend to go out on the street and proselytize, the Hare Krishnas probably have a very big spiritual aspect to what they do. They often put themselves in trances by, dancing down the street, chanting Hare Hare Krishna, with or without a spiritual aspect of that. It is well established psychologically that will elevate, one's brain chemistry and dopamine into a state of almost trance, or definitely trance. So yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's the cast in itself, the psychosomatic dimension of faith. Yeah. So, I mean, I have some points I can make here. About my own thoughts here, but I want to ask your thoughts here for a second, be devil's advocate for a second, because I've seen some passages that advance this idea of reincarnation and the idea that somehow the church is masquerading like it's actually a misrepresentation over centuries, right? I have here, I wrote down this as a note, this idea that I could kind of see this criticism given the progressive cultural misrepresentation of faith leading up to the Reformation. You have, by the time we've actually got from the apostolic church and the church fathers by succession and after the Council of Nicaea, we have a very bastardized version of actually what faith is. And the likes of indulgences and purgatory and these doctrines which are very extra biblical. Maybe they have support in the Apocrypha, but they're not actually within, say, what is considered to be the canonical books as attested to by the Reformation and the early church fathers as well. But yeah, maybe there's that kind of idea. It's critique is kind of based on this idea that it's a misrepresentation over time, and actually going back to the core, away from the Catholic misrepresentation, we're actually getting back to the core. It actually did involve reincarnation. But side point, I want to get just your take on, say, some of these verses, just a bit of exegesis, because these are some verses I've heard that advance the reincarnation idea, supposedly, right? So here's one from Ecclesiastes: "Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it." That's Ecclesiastes 12, verse 7. "For he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passeth away and cometh not again." Psalms 878, verse 39. So in both those instances, there's kind of an identification with nature and kind of the returning to the divine repository of souls, you could say, if it's what we're calling God there for a second.
Yeah.
And there's a number of passages in Job, interestingly enough, more than just the three of you have here, apparently. But here's a couple. "Before I go, whence I shall not return, even to the land of darkness and the shadow of death." Job 10, verse 21. "If a man die, shall he live again? All the days of my appointed time will I wait, till my change come." Job 14, verse 14. "But the man dieth and wasteth away. Yea, man giveth up the ghost, and where is he?" Job 14, verse 10 to 12. So again, that kind of appeal to maybe an annihilationism kind of doctrine, but also where does the soul of man go? It's kind of an open-ended question. I don't know, man. What's your take on, say, some of these passages, and they're trying to advance a certain idea and say, well, maybe this is reincarnation. What's your take?
I would. It's funny because I find some of those verses do the exact opposite. For example, Psalm 78:39, "For he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passeth away, and cometh not again." Does not come again. That's typically what reincarnation is about, is to come again, come back as something else in another form. That's kind of self-defeating. "If a man die, shall he live again?" I find it's just kind of rhetorical, same as for the "Yea, man giveth up the ghost, and where is he?" Again, it's kind of rhetorical. If you're reading reincarnation into that's, you're not using any biblical sources, and I guarantee you all of these passages within their context will hint nothing towards reincarnation, be it within just the chapter alone or the wider book that these verses belong to. And this is, again, we need to study the Bible contextually. We need to look at what the author was trying to convey, what the author believed, what the cultural context was that produced said writings. There is nothing that historically suggests that any of these biblical writers or people of their time in their culture would have believed that without being considered to be extremely strange. The theory of reincarnation doesn't, it tends to originate in the Far East, kind of India, China area, most likely India to begin with. And the interactions between where India's faith started to have an influence on the faiths of people in the church, be it Jewish or Christian, didn't come till at least the first century, really. There's the idea that potentially Thomas made it to India and witnessed there.
Well, there was a church there that dates to that time, right? Yeah,
definitely. And it seems, I think most scholars think that it was most likely Thomas. But anyway, the timing doesn't really work out. I'm just not sold. I'm not convinced. There's nowhere near strong enough argument for it. It's interesting, but again, it doesn't seem to align. That the closest you could get is with Gnostic texts. I wouldn't suggest the Apocrypha teaches anything about this. Any of the apocryphal works, be they later or earlier ones like Maccabees. Enoch definitely doesn't, as much as a lot of New Age esque kind of people would like to think. There's a lot of things around the Book of Enoch, and there's a lot of confusion between the Book of Enoch and the key, or the keys of Enoch. I think it's the key. Anyway, they're two very different texts. The Key of Enoch being far later than the Book of Enoch.
Enoch's thought to be post-exilic, is that right?
Potentially during, but yeah, maybe post. It's definitely Second Temple period where it was popular amongst Jews. So the time of Jesus, the intertestamental period. And Enoch was, the key of Enoch was not something that any of those Jews would have had because it wasn't there. And also it teaches something completely different to what the Book of Enoch is about. The Book of Enoch is, in its ending, partially apocalyptic, but for the most part, it's an extrapolation of what happened with the fall of the sons of God and the later flood, and Enoch's interactions with the divine, with God and with the angelic beings.
Yeah, because so my critique, I think, firstly starts of this theory starts with the fact that your mentions of afterlife in the Bible. So first of all, you're talking about Sheol or Tartaro or Gehenna in terms of the place where the belonging of souls, and that's kind of like a separation of body from soul. It's it's not congruent with an idea of actually what we typically have come to understand about reincarnation. They're kind of mutually exclusive ideas in the way they're referred to pretty consistently throughout the biblical narrative. We're not talking about similar things. And the idea of judgment and resurrection, resurrection particularly being kind of a later Judeo-Christian, doctrine that developed, theological idea. Resurrection kind of flies right in the face of reincarnation, where the ultimate goal of, say, a Buddhist or a Hindu for that matter, like different belief systems that endorse reincarnation as a belief, the ultimate goal is absolution, which is kind of annihilationism of the self, not personhood and personality. Whereas like a Christian worldview involving resurrection as a final destination has a very, it has an idea of the body and soul being reunited and reintegrated. So that's integral. Body is good, body isn't bad, body is good. That your imago Dei, your image of godness, is bodily, and that your personhood is actually part of that imago Dei. That actually you're not just removing that thing that makes you, but that actually in the idea of resurrection, there is a sense of very much of like you're a worshipful being, you and your personality, you yourself. That's pretty consistent within, you can look at, say, the Revelation passages, or either books of 1st or 2nd Corinthians actually talk quite a bit about resurrection. I'm thinking it might be 2nd Corinthians 15 talks quite at length about actually the last day and the trumpet resounding. And even at the time of Jesus, I have a passage here, which was John 11. Where are you on the page? Where John 11, Mary and Martha have just, had their brother Lazarus pass away. But the exchange between Martha and Jesus was, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day, because Jesus is asking, do you believe that he can come back to life? And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. So that shows that even at the time of Jesus, this was contemporary. This was thought that was kind of known and discussed about. This is kind of predating the idea. But even as an idea for kind of the thought being developed within the Bible, I think that's pretty consistent. That there was a known idea of the day of the Lord being the day of judgment, and there was a known kind of within Hebrew thought that there would be a day of reckoning where men would have to give account for their souls, before a just God as arbiter. Again, kind of not congruent. What I'm saying, kind of, it is not congruent with a view of reincarnation. I mean, I have another point there, but sorry, did you want to say something there? Jump in.
No. All good there.
So the other point I'd just say, so to borrow from a liberation theologian who I was studying about in my last year, my grad cert, Gustavo Gutierrez, he talked about a term which I became familiar with called the sacrament of history, being the sacrament of church history, the symbol of church history, as being, and some people are like, no, there are only 2 sacraments and everything, so they find that idea heretical. I like the appeal of the idea of the symbol of church history being a witness and a testimony to what God is doing throughout the ages. I think that's what the Catholics are trying to popularize there. But stick with me. Don't just get it put off. It's like, oh, Catholic doctrine heckles up. Like the Catholic sacrament of history actually refutes the idea that theology has been inconsistent if we study deeply enough. The closest is perhaps purgatory, which isn't a biblically based idea to reincarnation. But if we actually look, there has been a consistent theme, even throughout the age of the medieval church, about what is orthodoxy. There's been like a real contention where actually you follow the church history and you see people battling for, in some instances, not exaggeration, losing their life and being martyred for what was believed to be the truth of the Gospels. And pre-Nicene Creed, so early 4th century, we actually see a really consistent tradition about what actually the church believed. We actually had for about 3 centuries, crazy thought, a universal, unified church theologically. Schisms by and large weren't a thing because most heresy was stamped out pretty quickly, and there was a real keen sense of actually this is what the church believes regarding these ideas. And just this is important because when we're talking about this idea that actually maybe over history things have kind of been bastardized, and actually it doesn't seem consistent with even the church history account of things, because there has been this consistent thread which has remained steadfast and faithful. And that was a big part of the Reformation, right? Actually saying, no, we've got a whole off track and a lot of extra things that are regarding faith. Let's go back to the 5 solas and actually say, this is what salvation is. This is, what is Christianity. I really believe that the scriptures themselves and Jesus's beliefs, as well as Jewish belief, never really reflected a belief in reincarnation. Maybe in fringe sects or cults, but certainly not in the orthodox branches of the theology.
So next we have, speaking of conspiracy theories about Jesus, there is a group called the Jesus Seminar. Now, the Jesus Seminar is it's a think tank of New Testament scholars. Many, if not most, New Testament scholars worldwide consider the Jesus Seminar's viewpoints to be very radical. And I'm not talking about just Christian New Testament scholars. Now, this think tank, the Jesus Seminar, they claim that most of what is recorded of what Jesus said, that he did not actually say it. For example, the Lord's Prayer, that they have this grading system, and they've released a version of the New Testament where they have a color grading system. And I'll actually just bring that up. If a text is in black, they believe it is not something that was said. If it is in grey, it probably wasn't said. If it's in pink, it might have been, it probably was. And if it's red, it definitely was. So their red letter Bible is things that they believe Jesus definitely said. You can see here the Lord's Prayer. They are saying the only part of the Lord's Prayer that Jesus said was, "Our Father." There are some other things, hallowed be your name. Their translation here is impose your imperial rule. It's a bit weird, but they're saying he definitely said nothing about, in the heavens and enact your will on earth as you have in heaven and rescue us from the evil one. And that definitely makes the prayer easier to remember. Our Father. Honestly, since adopting the Jesus Seminar's approach, I have my, the bedtime prayers that Joanna and I do with our daughter Lottie, she loves it,
Very short.
So much quicker,
more like a mantra, I imagine. Just repeating our Father, our Father, our Father.
Our Father, boom, put it down, we're good. That's building her up. So anyway,
what are their criteria, friend? Do you know kind of by what criteria they say this is these colors?
I
noticed they mentioned in the margins there was this particular gospel, so corroborated. They also mentioned Q, which is thought to be the kind of source document for all the gospels, so that's accepted in scholarly thought. Just For those who don't
Yeah.
know, Q is a book, a repository of accounts that all the Gospels share. That's Q. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. Well, so I'll just read a few things that kind of cover that. And there is a New Testament scholar named Bill Witherington. He has said, the Jesus Seminar has received a tremendous amount of attention as a result of its controversial procedures and results and its concerted marketing campaign. The seminar itself is almost exclusively made up of North American scholars, and it is founded and dominated by a few of the more radical Jesus scholars in the US. Many of the major university religion departments, graduate schools, and seminaries are not represented at all. This is part of Bill Witherington's, it's in his book series of The Jesus Quest. Withering, he goes on later to talk about that the goal of the Jesus Seminar was to undermine the traditional views of Jesus and to do so publicly. He points out that, now, as to your question, for what is their criteria, Bill Witherington has pointed out that the Jesus Seminar approach their work with their conclusions drawn before research, which is, if anyone knows anything about basic academic scholarly work, be it in religion, history, literature, sciences, anything, you cannot do this. You cannot do this. And obviously we're all a little bit biased. We all have a little bit of bias, or a lot, but no one is exempt from that. But good academia, good scholarly work does its best and tries to check that at the gate before investigating, and then tries to draw a conclusion based off the evidence that they gather and the information that they gather.
Good, man.
Now, when speaking about this very matter, Michael Heiser, he points out exactly what I've said. That is not objective scholarship. To achieve objective scholarship, one must research and analyze the data, then come to a conclusion. So, membership of Jesus Seminar it excludes mainstream scholars. The mainstream scholars do not like the way that they do this. Ben Witherington, as I was saying, he later says in the Jesus Quest, one of the notable characteristics of the Jesus Seminar is that it is not a group sponsored by either of the two major scholarly guilds, the Society of Biblical Literature, SBL, which some of you may have heard of, or the European Society for the Study of the New Testament, SNTS. Instead, it is a group sponsored by the late New Testament scholar Robert W. Funk, who created his own publishing entity to publish what the seminar concluded. So membership in the Jesus Seminar only includes those who share the conclusions to begin with, which is idiosyncratically exclusive of mainstream scholarship and self-publishes its results to avoid peer review. Now, peer review isn't flawless, but it's in a lot of cases helpful. But the fact that they're doing this to avoid it, Robert W. Funk, something's funky here. I'm sorry.
It's giving me Passion Translation vibes a little bit, like
now,
from what you've told me.
Like we were saying, how did they come to these conclusions of what Jesus said? It's really random. It's just kind of what they feel like. So yeah, I actually have it written down here what their color coding system is, just in case I didn't get it right before. So red means Jesus said it, or something like that. Pink means he probably said it. Gray is doubtful. Black is a total rejection of what has been recorded. So the way that they do it is they vote. So they have these marbles of these different colors, and they say, okay, did Jesus say who is my mother? Who is my brother? And then the members of the Jesus seminar cast a marble. They cast stones. And whoever just voted, so it's a democracy. It's not actually a balance of stronger arguments or anything.
Haven't you mentioned to me as well that so like a popular skeptical biblical scholar, Bart Ehrman, like he's actually skeptical of the Jesus seminar, isn't that right?
He is skeptical. So it's been criticized by many people. N.T. Wright, who says, and I quote, "I cannot understand how, if a majority thought a saying authentic or probably authentic, the weighted average turned out to be probably inauthentic. A voting system that produces a result like this ought to be scrapped." Spot on there, Tom. And another New Testament scholar has summed up the voting process by saying, in practice, this meant an averaged majority vote by people who were not in any reasonable sense authorities at all. So the thing about the Jesus seminar is they're very stubborn, and they try to make it seem like they speak for the majority of New Testament scholars, which again just isn't true.
And do you think this is problematic in that, to some degree in the popular culture, they've actually been successful in some of those areas?
Yes, very, very much so. So
right.
Like Ben Witherington was saying, they have a lot of marketing campaigns. Michael Heiser pointed out that oftentimes in Easter, during Easter, you'll see a lot of things on newsstands or in the supermarket, on, magazine covers, or, things like, who is the real Jesus, the Jesus of the Bible versus the Jesus of history? These things that are trying to say, like, Jesus never said this, are usually members of the Jesus seminar that are trying to put this out there. They have had, like Witherington said, a lot of media attention, a lot, because their views are so radical. And media love portraying that because that gets a lot of attention. It's a very wild and wacky claim because it's so batshit crazy that it's not like that it gets people's attention. And then they're like, oh, these people are scholars. There's a whole group of them, and they're working together. They must be, and they don't have the bias of being Christian, which again is just complete and total nonsense to bring that up when you're talking about New Testament scholarship, because if you're an atheist, you have a certain bias about that as well. But again,
it's assuming that
the good scholars will check their bias.
Yeah, it's assuming that, like, none of us have bias, basically, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So one thing that's important is to look at what they believe, about Jesus. They think Jesus was illiterate, that he did not think of himself as divine at all, or as any kind of Messiah. And since he was illiterate, he had no interest in Jewish scripture. Now, historically, this is just wrong, because many boys were brought up going to Jewish school, even the poor ones. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Going to Jewish school, learning the scriptures. That there's no good reason to think that Jesus didn't do that. They believe that since he was literate and had no interest in the scripture, that he had no interest in eschatology, the theory of end times. So anything that Jesus said about eschatology, that's not okay by the Jesus Seminar, and therefore anything that's written about eschatology by the apostles does not reflect what Jesus taught. So it's a steaming pile of garbage, academic wise.
But so it's been obviously very successful in convincing popular culture of credibility. Do you have some of those names, friend, of like, if people hear some of these names, oh, that's a Jesus Seminar person?
Yes, I've got some here,
because I guess that's good for your average listener. If they hear a name, it's like, oh, that sounds pretty compelling. It's like, oh, actually, that's a Jesus Seminar person. I can swiftly put that to bed.
Yeah. So, like I said earlier, Robert W. Funk, who was the founder, I will save probably what I believe to be the biggest name till later. Here are just a few names. Stephen L. Harris, also dead, I believe. John Dominic Crossan, Robert M. Price, so some may recognize that name. Burton Mack. But probably a name that a lot of people will recognize is Marcus Borg. Marcus Borg was an Episcopalian, he is an Episcopalian, is he alive still? I don't know. An Episcopalian theologian who I do not call Christian.
Well, he's been associated with progressive Christianity, hasn't he?
Very much so, and even a lot of progressive Christians don't like what he has to say. So he's so he is dead. But yeah, there's so those are some of the names to look out for.
Okay.
But yeah, it's interesting. The Jesus Seminar, definitely, if you ever see anything of that within the world of arguments about historical criticism or reliability, and you need to know where to go, just refer people to Ben Witherington's work. Again, he's done some great things about the Jesus Seminar in the Jesus Quest and elsewhere. Just look it up yourself and show you. It's very easy to show how little scholarship is put into their ideas and into their process. I
imagine Gary Habermas would be another good authority to refer to on some of these.
Yep, Gary Habermas. Yeah. He's I believe he's done some really good things, and I think William Lane Craig even might have in passing tackled a few of the things put forth by the Jesus Seminar. So again, if we come across the Jesus Seminar, we know that is crazy. That fits into our category of crazy conspiracy theories about Jesus, because their approach is not rational. It is not something that is anything more than theory.
So the next theory we want to look at, got a couple more here, was a theory that Jesus simply didn't exist. Jesus and Christianity were invented by members of secret societies and mystery schools in order to unify the Roman Empire under one state religion. So this is similar to some of the ones we've already talked about so far, but like straight away, there's just a couple of things we can dissect this and put this to bed pretty swiftly, right? So,
well, I mean,
go on.
Oh no, I was just going to say they already kind of had a state religion that was relatively unified. The one exception being the Jewish people were not as compliant, but the Romans still had worked out a deal under the Pax Romana, the time of peace, and
That's
under
right.
the Roman rule. So
Right.
they didn't need Christianity to do that.
Yeah, so some people have kind of like attributed it to the whole role of Constantine the Great, that like basically he wanted peace in the empire, and Christianity was one means to achieve that. But I don't know, like some of the arguments, and I'm open to being convinced otherwise, but the arguments I've heard are pretty spurious. Anyway, I would say the historical, it's hard to maintain this belief that Jesus simply didn't exist given the historical accounts. So for one, and William Lane Craig has done good work on this, the Gospels themselves are accepted on good authority as being historical accounts. So what about religious bias? No, like the Gospels themselves are accepted as actually these are historical accounts of a man named Jesus and the teaching that he gave. And this is pretty well attested to in scholarship, ignoring the Jesus seminar, but that actually these were historical accounts, even by skeptics, even by atheists and agnostics. They'll say, yep, there was a Jesus and there wasn't a guy that exists. And they come to different conclusions about, say, moments like the miracles or, the resurrection, but pretty in accordance that it was true. Independent of that, you have Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, so no motivation to be, convincing us of truths around Jesus, or Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, who both attest to the reality of Jesus of Nazareth. Both talk about actually how he did miracles. This is independent attestation outside the Gospels of the Gospel narrative of things, accordance of things, much shorter in their accounts, obviously, but actually definitely attests to like a lot of the core details about the faith. And I'd say moreover, it doesn't fit the timeline because you have almost 400 years of persecution, probably closer to 300 in fact, which are well recorded, and the records of the church thinking by various church leaders and correspondence / written works, they showed a consistent orthodoxy in contest with false doctrine. This is a little bit like what we talked about before with the theory around reincarnation being kind of a hush-hush doctrine within the church, and it was actually always there. Like, even though it was a persecuted church, one, that kind of gives you some verification of the validity of these people. They were willing to be martyred for their faith. They were willing to die for the sincerity and the authenticity of doctrine. That needs to be considered. And two is the fact that actually there's lots of records. I mean, I was teaching a class even recently and talking about Tertullian, and he wrote something like 2,000 treatises on various aspects of theology, quoting all sorts of different scripture and making different references. Like the early church fathers, and not even the popular ones that are knowing, the bishops were pretty prolific in their writings, and there was a pretty consistent theme about what is orthodoxy. And what's really important about their role is that they are a line of succession back to the apostles. You talk about Polycarp, you talk about Ignatius of Antioch or Clement of Rome. These were people who saw the apostles in person. and taught people themselves. And those apostles were the people who saw Christ, like that's, I think, an important thing when we think about the succession. So I think we can put that bed to pretty swiftly. I have a couple of things there I can say there, but did you want to say something to that, my friend?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to, without because going through all of the early, the patristic period, all of the early church fathers, and going through Tacitus and Josephus' writings and all those, it can be a bit arduous and tough to interpret a lot of them because there are different translations. And someone who's put together a lot of things for this is Mike Licona. He's a New Testament historian. He does some great things now. He's done some great things with the works of Josephus and Tacitus. His YouTube account, very easy to find if you just YouTube Mike Licona. He has a lot of great things about that.
And I forgot even to mention, like Eusebius, early church historian, super important because he took it upon himself to write the church history leading up to Constantine and actually secure it all and actually go to the primary and secondary sources and kind of compile it all together. This is an account of early church history. 1700 years.
But he was a member of the church, so he's biased, and because of that, you have to scrap it all together entirely.
You have to scrap all my arguments so far, then, basically. Whereas Mike Licona, 2,000 years in the future, like clearly unbiased.
But in terms of scholars genuine academic scholars who deny the existence of Jesus of Nazareth, there aren't many. I think I said this in the last, in part one, probably, you can count them on one hand last I checked. There is one guy who's making a slightly stronger argument, Robert M. Price, who I still haven't read his book. It's The Case Against the Case for Christ. And he goes through and rebuts every part of Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ. But from skimming it, I've not been convinced. Obviously, skimming a book, you don't get everything from it. But not that history or theology is a democratic process, but it does say something when a heck of a lot of scholars who are definitely worth their weight in anything of value laugh that off. Bart Ehrman, for example, when he has been asked about Jesus mythicists, the people who claim Jesus is a myth, he just says, "No, I don't have any time for that. I don't address that." And I saw a video of him talking about. He said, "I don't even address that in my classes because that's not worth my time." So that'll tell you a little bit about that.
I mean, on the Constantine comment, so Constantine the Great only came around the early 4th century, and so the Nicene Council, which was so pivotal in establishing, these beliefs around, the substance of the Son. Was he, co-eternal with God, or was he, of similar substance? That whole debate there, or the dating of Easter, or like the confirmation of what was the canon. So important church event. The Nicene Council was really only confirming doctrine that was already pre-established as being debated, not these ideas which arise as a critique later.
And all Constantine had to do with the Council of Nicaea was basically calling for it to happen. He wasn't. He had nothing to do with how it went. No. He wasn't controlling. There are a lot of conspiracy theories that go on about Constantine and him orchestrating the Council of Nicaea, like some little puppet show. But also something that a lot of people forget is he wasn't the first Christian Roman emperor. There's a few things about that. Someone who's written a bit about that is Bart Ehrman in The Triumph of Christianity. Speaks a little bit about that. I think there were one or two before him that were Christian. I think the one before him wasn't the nicest, and probably it's questionable to say he was a Christian emperor, but he went around destroying pagan temples and idols and statues, and had his forces kill people who were practicing old Roman and Greco-Roman paganism, which is again not the Christian approach. So to say that the use of Christianity within the Roman Empire was only a force of peace, again, it hasn't always been done for that, and Constantine kept on using that for wars as well as justification. I mean, look at all of Augustine's theories on just wars.
Mm.
Yeah.
Just talking about that in class just today, actually, funnily enough.
Yeah, which George Bush ended up using later on. So
so coming back to this whole idea of Jesus simply didn't exist, Jesus and Christianity were invented by members of secret societies and mystery schools in order to unify Roman Empire into one state religion. I think it's also important to say here that, like the Jesus as other gods argument above, the dissimilarities are actually more exclusive than the similarities. A, that's an important thing to say here. And B, these developments that parallel Christian teaching around Jesus were later developments, not prior. Yeah. So that's just an important thing. Similar to the arguments for that myth and theory and why we can dismiss it, it's similar to what we can say here. But I think this is a good segue. Well, I love hearing Caleb talk. My friend, what can you tell us about Mormonism and about its views of Jesus?
Okay. To start off, now it goes back and forth depending on who the prophet is. For those of you who don't know, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints started by Joseph Smith, who received revelation of a third testament and a greater testament of the Bible, which is now known of as the Book of Mormon. He was the prophet and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. When he died, his friend Brigham Young took over, and it's gone ever since. When a prophet dies, I'm not too sure if it's similar to popes where you can revoke it. I don't know if you can. I think it is until you die. But anyway,
so sorry, this is Joseph Smith and then Brigham. What did you say his name
Brigham
was?
Young.
Brigham Young. Joseph Smith, Brigham Young. Okay.
Brigham Young University is the Mormon university, based out of Provo in Utah, and there are other BYU campuses around the world, but some people may have heard of BYU or Brigham Young University. Anyway, they always have a prophet. Now, prophets will always say, what they say may supersede what a previous prophet has said. There is some contention at the moment about this, but this is only within the last couple of years that this has started happening. The reason I bring this up is the term Mormon has not always been the nicest term. They don't call themselves Mormons all the time, but with their previous president, I think it was Thomas Modson, he started this big campaign, and some people, when they hear about this, they might think, I've seen some of those, of I'm a Mormon, and they were embracing the term Mormon because previously Mormons was the outsider's name for them. They always called themselves members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or LDS. But yeah, that there were
To be
They had a
confused
lot
with
of famous.
LSD.
I think Joseph Smith was too. And you might have seen some videos of there was a famous basketball player who was I'm a Mormon. But anyway, the current the Killers, the band, all members.
Really?
Yep. I don't know if they're
That's-
all currently now, but during Mr. Brightside, definitely.
South Park, not Mormons. We'll link that particular video of their tribute to Mormonism in the description.
Yeah. So anyway, they have now moved away from the term Mormon again with the current president. It really depends. Now this tells you a lot about the state of the church, of the LDS Church. A good book that I will always recommend to people is by ex-members Gerald and Sandra Tanner, The Changing World of Mormonism. They were scholars for BYU, I believe, and they ended up leaving when they became disillusioned with all of these historical changes within the church, be it belief, doctrine, practice, etc. Now, the thing about the LDS Church is that they are very, very different from mainstream Christianity in a lot of ways, but who they believe Jesus to be is very interesting. In the creation of this world, God the Father, they often refer to him as Elohim, which is correct biblically. But they believe Elohim only applies to God the Father typically. Elohim was populating the earth with spirit babies, with his many wives, because they believe he's a physical being and that he is having sex with his wives to impregnate them, and then they give birth to spirit babies so they believe in the pre-existence of the soul, which typically most mainstream Christians do not. The Bible does not teach that. It teaches that God knitted us together in the womb and that he breathed life into us in our mother's womb.
Right, so moment of conception is also the creation of the soul, like the...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So with them, it's a pre-existence, kind of like Scientology. And anyway, in the creation of this earth, these spirit babies became angels who were to later, come down and come into the bodies of people on this earth as they were born or as they were in the womb. Now, God held a council saying, these people will sin. How do we save them? How do we bring them salvation so they can be reconciled to me? And God's oldest son, Lucifer, said, who was a very prideful man, said, Father, I will be the Messiah for your people. I will bring them to you. I will force them. And I will force them to follow you. And if they do not, they are damned. And God did not like that. Elohim, the Father, did not like that. And he said that, no, I cannot force them. They need to come to me of their own accord. They need to choose. And Jesus offered a way. He said, I will sacrifice myself on their behalf so that I will take their sins. And Jesus, being Satan or Lucifer's little brother, was chosen for this task. Now, out of spite of not being chosen as the Messiah, Lucifer rebelled against God, took a third of the angels with him, and those angels were cursed. They would still go down to earth, but they would become black-skinned or brown-skinned people. So, you can easily find documentation that the LDS Church has believed this at many points and still do kind of teach this. Because of this, for a very, very long time, until 1978, black or brown-skinned members of the church could not hold a priesthood, which is what you do to get into going on a mission. Even before that, just being a part of a lot of, sacred duties in the church. Now, what was happening in 1978, long story, but they were breaking into Southern America. They were also breaking into the Pacific Islands. And they...
By the way, didn't it blow your mind when there was a BLM protest in Salt Lake City, led by Mormons?
Yeah. Well, that's a growing movement within the student body, especially.
Get out!
I
was taking the piss. I was. Yeah. Are you serious?
There wasn't a BLM protest, but there's a growing movement of racial equality and recognition of the church's past treatment of black peoples.
By the way, good, super important.
Yeah.
But just crazy.
Yeah. So anyway, they. So
are they I'm sorry. I'm kind of I'm just want to rack your brains a little bit here. It's are there current prophets that are kind of we don't talk about that part, or we're kind of going to denounce that? Is that just kind of we don't talk about that period of history?
They were. Now there's this thing called the Gospel Topics Essays, which has recently been released. And it was in 2013 or something. They wrote these essays to help their members find official answers to questions they might have when they're looking up certain things, and they come across an accusation against the church. And then they've started talking about a whole lot of things that are actually very problematic in their past. But instead of having the effect that they intended of trying to bring more openness, a lot of people have been oh, so you're saying that you did this and that you're fine with it, and that you're okay with Brigham Young having been an awful racist, murderous man, Joseph Smith being a womanizing pedophile who married a 14-year-old girl and coerced a lot of other women to leave their husbands and marry him. Anyway, 1978, two things are happening. They're breaking into a lot of black and brown cultures. They wanted to build a temple in Brazil, and the Brazilian government said, get rid of this racist bull crap, or we will not let you build a temple. At the same time, the IRS in the United States, the tax department, they were saying, get rid of this racist bull crap, or we will take away your non-profitable charity status, religious status. So God, being, being subject to the worldly governments in the world he created, he obeyed them, and he changed his mind, and he brought revelation to the prophet at the time, who I think might have been Spencer W. Kimball.
That's really convenient.
Yeah.
What did it change? What did it change to? What was the doctrine now?
It's that wrong. Black people can now hold the priesthood.
But it doesn't deny any of the past stuff. That wasn't true.
No, not at all. But Spencer W. Kimball, I can't see if he was the guy at the time, but anyway, interesting, because I will share my screen here really quickly before I move on. Who does this guy look like to you?
Looks familiar. I can't put my finger on it though.
When you Google just his name, he does, doesn't he? He looks like Yoda. For those of you who are listening, Google Spencer W. Kimball. He looks a lot like Yoda. Probably only redeemable thing about the guy.
Is it the ears?
Anyway,
I think it's the ears.
This is brought up in, as Jared mentioned, the creators of South Park. They did a musical that I think started in 2011 or 12, called The Book of Mormon. It's about two young missionaries who are, young white American guys, one who's a little bit dopey and one who's, very much, proper and has always done things right and believes that he's going to eventually be the next prophet of Mormonism and blah, blah, blah. They posted to a small mission in Uganda, where there are child soldiers and female circumcision, and no people in the town have ever been baptized to the church. And it's a great musical. It got so many Tony Awards. Incredible musical. Joanna, my wife, and I, when we went to London, we saw it. It came to New Zealand. We saw it twice in New Zealand. It's honestly such a good musical. I can recommend it to anyone. Listen to the soundtrack alone, and the music is great. The choreography is great. It's hilarious. But anyway, there's this one song sung by one of the main characters, Elder Price, who is the one who believes, he is a strong Mormon. He's had a crisis of faith, so he's decided to just say, I'm going to be a better Mormon. And the song's called I Believe. And in one of the things, he's saying, I believe that the Lord God created the universe. I believe that he sent his only son to die for my sins. And I believe that ancient Jews built boats and sailed to America. I am a Mormon, and a Mormon just believes. And then later he goes on to say, and I believe that the Lord God sent me here, and I believe that in 1978 God changed his mind about Black people. And then the chorus, he goes, Black people. Again, it just shows the wackiness of their changing views of Jesus. Jesus lives on a planet called Kolob that oversees the earth. This has less been about the theories of Jesus, but just more about the LDS movement in general, and to show that anything you hear about Jesus from them probably can't be trusted.
Did you say Kolob?
Kolob, yes, Kolob.
It sounds like the whole prophetic. It sounds like the whole prophetic movement, a collab between like actually what is correct or not, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Or maybe it's God the Father that lives on Kolob, but either way, you get your own planet if you do well enough in the Mormon church and you become a god. So God of this universe was once a man, and there's uncountable gods. So
so I suppose the critique there is then people are saying, well, there are so many various depictions of Jesus. How do we know which one is true? I think an easy one to put to bed here is to actually say, well, the LDS depiction of Jesus is not consistent. Yeah, it's not Bible. It's not consistent with actually what is the historic and traditional view of who Jesus is. It's something quite antithetical. Therefore, we can kind of dismiss it as being authority.
Yeah.
That's not to say that actually people who are members of that church can't become born again believers. And then there seems to be quite a number of them who often, once they do that, they do often journey towards orthodoxy, more orthodox Christian belief.
Yeah.
That seems to be
I even believe there are some people within the LDS movement who are saved.
Yes.
Because one thing about the LDS movement is it is a hierarchical movement in terms of the more you go up the chain, hierarchical isn't the right word, but it is hierarchical. Initiative, I guess, as you go up into different things, as you gain different priesthoods, different accreditations, when you go to the temple and get your endowment, which is a ceremony, very creepy one. Look it up. I'll link some stuff. You learn more things. Now, there are some, I think back in the 90s, it was estimated, I don't know about current numbers, it was estimated that only about 10% of members actually make it to the temple. So most of the teachings aren't necessarily available to all of them, or haven't been, unless they do their own looking, which they're discouraged from doing. They're encouraged to look within the resources that are recommended for their level. And I've spoken to some members of the LDS Church who believed Jesus to be one and the same with the Father. They believed him to be a Trinitarian God. My grandmother, my late grandmother, was she was brought up Catholic. At one point, she fell in with the LDS Church. Her husband, my grandfather, was an atheist, so he didn't go along. But because of that, she was married to an atheist. She had no chance of making it in the ranks. But at the time, she believed in the Trinitarian God and that Jesus was the one way to salvation because he paid for the sins that we have made, which have offended God. She believed in penal substitution. She probably couldn't at the time have explained it very well, but believed it. And she was a Christian. Later, she ended up leaving the movement, praise the Lord, and came into Christian church movements. And I will see her again one day. But even if she had died when she was a member, I would still say the same.
Yeah, amen to that, man.
Yeah.
I think it's a beautiful anecdote to share into this as well, because it's like, it's illustrating that point on some of these theories. There is some points of convergence where, in terms of the more dogmatic tenets of faith, there is enough convergence that we can still say, okay, that's nutty, but me, even though you believe that, I can still call you a brother and sister in Christ. Probably as our penultimate one, like it's good to probably spend about like 5 or 10 minutes here talking about Jesus as depicted by Islam, because this is kind of an instance where we have dogma being kind of mutually exclusive, right?
Yeah.
Islam was a later development as a monotheistic faith, as Allah around the 6th century with the Prophet Muhammad. It's interesting, there's a lot of convergence in terms of the spiritual authority that, say, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, or the New Testament letters hold, or actually the person of Jesus. Islam reveres and holds Jesus in some high regard. They hold and believe that he was born of a virgin. They believe that he was supposed to be revered. They hold that he was one of the successions of major prophets, one of 4 key messengers. They hold that he was a miracle worker. They hold that he ascended and will come again. Some tenets of Islam even hold that he will judge the world. And it's interesting that even in the Quran, apparently, like Caleb might be able to, credibly assert to this more than I can. Apparently, Jesus is mentioned more in the Quran than Muhammad is an interesting point.
He is.
Yeah.
He is in the Quran, but that's partially because the Quran was written by Muhammad himself, so he wouldn't have written much in the third person. I believe there are segments where he does, but
yeah. So like the difference,
he wasn't as into himself as Moses was. When Moses writes that Moses was a very humble and the most humble man.
I mean, he also did write that he struck the rock and did a number of things like killed a guy. So criterion.
I mean, there is a lot of academic debate as to whether or not he wrote it entirely on his own. He may have had help from Joshua and others.
Yes.
But
and might have been a post-exilic compilation. Anyway, coming back to this, differences. So, and it should be said that a lot of Muslims actually hold their Old Testament being a similar origins. A lot of them actually trace their origins back to Ishmael. So Genesis 16, 11, 12, Abraham has been made a covenant promise by God, from you all nations will be blessed. And that lineage, as we know, came from Isaac. But Abraham kind of thought I'm going to kind of speed this process up a little bit, or specifically Sarai did. It's I'm getting too old. I can't have a kid. Here's my maiden, have a child with her, and she will be, the child bearer in my stead, which was kind of a commonly accepted practice for surrogacy in those days, apparently.
Yeah.
And so Ishmael was the child of that instance. Caused some friction between Sarai and Hagar. That was the mother. I have here, which I can mention, 16:11 to 12. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over all his kinsmen. And so a lot of Muslims attribute their presence in kind of the covenant line, or kind of their spiritual heritage, to this particular ancestor, not Isaac, but Ishmael. But it's also important here to actually, there's some key differences that as I understand, particularly concerning theories around Jesus. They believe that Jesus was a mortal man, and that his original message was lost or altered. Again, one of these four key messages. They probably have some fans in the Jesus seminar, some allegiance there, right? They also believe that he ascended bodily into heaven and that he survived the cross. That's an interesting one. They believe that he will come back to defeat the Antichrist and come back to live out the rest of his natural lifespan, which a lot of premillennialists might actually have yep, we agree with that idea too. Muslims also disagree with the idea of the Trinity. They're monotheistic at the core, like Jews, and actually say, well, God, Allah, is one.
The Tawhid principle.
Yes. Certain eschatology as well believes Islam to be the fulfillment of biblical prophecy regarding enemies of the faith. Islam itself traces its origins back to Ishmael and Edom, which I mentioned. Esau secondarily as well. But yeah, those are some points of similarity, but more points of divergence than convergence.
It's interesting looking at the ideas of the relation with the Old and even New Testament that Islam has. Muhammad is recorded, and I can't remember which hadith it is, but it is considered to be, I can't remember the names they use. There are different gradings of hadiths, and this is the most reliable grading accepted by most Muslims. When one thing that was recorded that Muhammad said is, if you have any issues and problems with interpreting the Quran, go to the people of the book. And by that he meant Christians or Jews. He said, look at the Bible, look at the Old and New Testament, and consult that. He seemed to hold the Bible at times in a higher esteem than his writings of the Quran. It's just one of the things that a lot of Muslim apologists will counter with potentially here, is that, well, since then the Bible has lost its genuine, reliability. So yeah, it's one thing when it comes to Islamic views on Jesus is there are a lot of stories that are told in the Quran and hadiths about Jesus by Muhammad. And these stories have striking similarities to the Gnostic stories of the infancy gospels and other of Jesus.
And
now, where does that? Yeah.
Can I just,
No,
sorry, just to jump back a bit for the audience sake, a hadith, is that like the oral tradition attributed to?
No, sorry. So the hadiths are supplementary texts that are used to help interpret the Quran. They were written by Aisha, Muhammad's most favored wife, who, by the way, was 6 years old when he married her. But it's okay. He's a good guy because he didn't consummate the marriage till she was 9.
So glad you cleared that up.
Yeah. Piece of crap.
Messed up. Sorry, that's good to clarify.
I welcome the death threats that will come from that.
So the supplementary sources is what you're saying. And
so yeah, these hadiths were written by Aisha, by some of his friends, and a lot of Muslims refer to them in terms of things that Muhammad said about the Quran, in terms of because with the Quran it's him writing it, but then sometimes his followers would ask him, hey, when you wrote this, what does Allah mean when he told you to write this? And Muhammad would interpret it. And also some of the hadiths were just stories about Muhammad and his life and the history of Islam.
Right. Sorry, I caused you to lose your train of thought. That's
cool. That's cool. So anyway, a lot of the Islamic stories of Jesus are very similar or almost identical to the stories found in the Gnostic texts. Where does this come from? So, as Jared said, the movement is quite a lot older than Christianity. It's about 6 centuries older. In fact, it is 6 centuries older, but newer, sorry. It came 6 centuries after Christianity was birthed. In the province that Muhammad was in, which is now modern day Arabic, kind of Saudi Arabia-ish area, parts of Saudi Arabia, definitely. There was a lot of Arabic paganism. And that was what Muhammad was brought up around. And his message of tawhid, of that is the Islamic principle of monotheism, that Allah is one God and one alone. That was very revolutionary for a lot of people, because there were hundreds of gods that in their pantheon. And with a lot of gods came a lot of mysticism and esoteric, well, not esoteric, but a lot of spiritualism and the like. Now, with that came a lot of embracing of things like paganism. A lot of things like Gnostic views. The Gnostic texts, which were found in Nag Hammadi in Egypt, it's not surprising that they would have made it a little bit up the Arabic Peninsula towards, Arabic land, up towards Saudi Arabia. So a lot of what Muhammad would have consulted for stories about Jesus would have been people who were Gnostics or who were influenced by Gnostics. So he doesn't have access to the primary source texts.
Secondary sources.
He doesn't have access to the primary source, which is the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John. And he has no right to interpret who Jesus was and is correctly.
Because I suppose, like, even then, the Bible isn't as we know it. It's not like a book of 66. It's more like the separate books which are accepted as canon, right? Like, I mean, I guess the Latin Vulgate was a thing, but there still would have been a lot of instances where the Bible existed as disparate texts, more or less, right? Yeah.
And I think and other theories is, like you mentioned, they don't teach that. In fact, they teach that Jesus did not die on the cross. There are different approaches to that. The main one is the swoon theory, which we covered in part 1.
Yes.
There are other theories that that God gave him a certain amount of strength to deal with it.
Whereas your description
he pretended.
I mean, your description of the medical procedure and crucifixion kind of quickly defeats that, right?
Yeah, well, that's with the swoon theory. The other theory is that God put a certain amount of strength in Jesus to not actually be hurt or be hurt as much. So then he pretended to be hurt and pretended to die. Then there's the other theory of, I think it's I can't remember the name of the theory, but basically when Jesus wasn't carrying the cross briefly, he actually swapped over.
Old switcheroo.
Yeah, swapped over with, what's his name?
Was it one of Simon of Cyrene? Or Simon
of Cyrene, so that Jesus swapped.
And then he did marry Mary Magdalene. He went off and
brilliant. So he swapped with Simon of Cyrene because Allah bestowed upon him the messianic power to do so. So it was Simon of Cyrene that was crucified and killed.
Poor guy.
Because Jesus put his face onto Simon's. You'd think he'd be saying, like, hang on, like, why are you guys putting, why are you nailing me to this thing? I was just helping the dude.
Yeah. Who would have thought, like, poor guy, that a whole religion would have been started on the back of this crucifixion, right? Cyrenians, like.
Yeah.
That's
so again, there are some different theories about Jesus within Islam that are just and one thing that a lot of Christians need to be prepared for when speaking to Muslims about the deity of Christ. One thing they will almost always, because they've been taught to do this, one thing they will almost always say in these arguments is, show me in the Gospels, where did Jesus say, I am God, worship me? They're not looking for you to say, when Jesus claimed I am, or to be Son of Man, or to forgive sins, or many of the other things that signal Jesus' deity. They want the exact words, I am God, worship me. Quick answer is turn it around, because same logic. Where did he say, I am not God, do not worship me? In those exact words. Who has some great resources for these kind of things is David Wood of Act 17 Apologetics. We'll link him below. But yeah, that's that's me for Islamic views on Jesus.
Which I think, my friend, brings us to kind of closing out. We could talk a little bit about actually has Jesus as depicted by other religions generally, but maybe that's a subject for another podcast some point in the future. I will say here, like, many religions affirm like Jesus was righteous, wise, he was a miracle worker of spiritual significance, and he had followers and died, but differ on the matter of his divinity for their own inherent reasons. It's like, oh, we can't agree with that. That's what we can't abide for these various reasons. Some even accept his divinity. Most don't. But the problem we run in all these instances is truth by nature is mutually exclusive, and that dogmatic tenets of belief cancel each other out. You look to John 14, verse 6, which Caleb mentioned before. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. There's not a lot of room for wriggle room for reinterpretation there and say, well, Jesus could have meant with this, pretty exclusive. Or, John chapter 1, verse 1 to 5, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing that has been made was made. And the revelation of that word was made flesh, and that is Jesus. Again, pretty categorically exclusive theological claims about the nature of Jesus, which doesn't give a lot of room for it could also mean this or it could also mean that. But we would probably advocate, if Christine was here, she would do the same thing. I think a lot of this comes back to when you hear these different views, a Mike Winger approach would be, rather than knowing the different beliefs, which has credibility, don't get me wrong, the best defense is really know your scriptures. Really get into your word and know what the word says about these different things, because I feel like it's not by accidence that, Holy Spirit inspired canon has a lot of stuff that actually refutes these ideas inherently. And there's enough in there that you can actually say, this doesn't work. Yeah. Would you say anything further on that point, friend, on just
just to reiterate that point is, an analogy that has been offered for this very practice of know your scripture beyond others is people who work to spot counterfeit money. They don't go out and learn what every counterfeit bill will have wrong with them.
Good.
What they do instead is they look at every legitimate accepted form of the dollar bills that are available, and they learn the intricacies and details of those. And then any counterfeit that comes across, they can say, okay, this is different. This is wrong. This is wrong. So again, reiterating, I just feel the need, even though Jared has explained it perfectly, it's worth reiterating because it is a worthy endeavor. Yeah.
No, so solid. Great analogy too, man. Love that. Is that a Caleb Zwitek original?
No, I can't remember where. I think it was on the Cultish podcast where they were talking about the very same principle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm.
That about wraps us up for Crazy Theories Part 2. Thanks so much for listening. Coming up, we have an interview with the former CEO of the Warehouse Group and Kerry Baptist College Professor in Apologetics, Mark Powell, a two-part testimony with our new co-host, Tony G, and a two-part discussion with our in-house expert on sex before, during, and after marriage done biblically, Christine Walton. We also look to have Caleb join us again for a fun one, Movies That Messed Us Up Part 2, and the trial of our first live Christian pop commentary cast. Stay tuned for more details to come.